Saturday Night Fever's iconic soundtrack is celebrating its 40th anniversary today. And I just realized that I have been alive on its 10th anniversary, on its 20th anniversary, and its 30th. And for all of those anniversaries, I did not actually own this album. And that is a good way to thematically wrap this entire video around. Because after doing some soul searching about how I was going to approach the anniversary of this album on vinyl, and I know I've discussed this vinyl in at least 2 of my videos, one revolving around the best-selling albums of all time, and my soundtrack collection, the fact of the matter is, there was a lot that revolved around this album in my life and why I didn't have it for a long time. The first reason was that for most of my childhood and adolescence, at the very best, just the mention of the word disco was something to laugh at. Basically what I would understand with the term camp. But Henrique, who I'm going to shout out to again, Hopkins out in San Leandro, California, who's been a good friend of mine for over a decade now, online. I've never actually met him. Said something to me some years ago, you don't want to knock disco. And, I'm a big funk and jazz person, and all the combinations in between. Funk, soul, and jazz, that's my thing. And for years, I always kind of understood disco as a weaker part of that. Long story short, it's a lusher part of it, but I'll get to the point straight out. One of the main stigmas about this album was the Bee Gees. It was only recently, through the man who actually gave this album to me, my boyfriend Scott Edwards, that I realized the love that people have for the Bee Gees. I've started to respect their music years ago, but, from their early Baroque kind of material on through their soft ballad period in the 70s, on through writing for others in the 1980s, and even during the disco era. The Bee Gees were some of the best songwriters out there and had some of the most beautiful vocal harmonies and wrote really complex songs with a lot of really elaborate chord changes that almost sometimes bordered on jazzy things. The Bee Gees had an amazing, ability as, in fact, they're iconic composers. And that's the most important thing to me about this particular soundtrack. Disco as a musical genre, it's basically a dancing style and a club style, but, playing records rather than having a live band at a club, DJing. But the first disco album I am familiar with is the 1973 Gloria Gaynor album, Never Can Say Goodbye. And it's a series of long extended cuts with what they call a 4 on the floor, dance beat oriented around the bass drum playing, and a thump kind of built onto that. And disco can actually be a lot of things, and you can add a lot of things to it. It's kind of like jazz in the way that, a lot of jazz horn soloists feel they can actually solo over anything. But disco as a form has been misunderstood most of my life. I always thought of it in the negative cultural context, which I know are now laced with racism and homophobia and sexism to an enormous degree, but that's not what I'm talking about here. Listening to this particular soundtrack and understanding what it is, it's really deeply connected musically to a lot of things I actually love, and I deeply regret avoiding it now. A little history on this. Apparently, when, the characters of Tony Manero and Annette in Saturday Night Fever, John Travolta, were doing a rehearsal scene in the dance studio, they were dancing to Boz Scaggs' Lowdown, which is one of my favorite disco-era funk soul things, really lush production. And they were going to use that in a rough cut of this film, which was produced by Robert Stigwood, who of course founded RSO. And at the time, they were actually thinking of calling a film tribal rights of a Saturday night. And of course they changed it. But Columbia didn't want to relinquish any rights to Stigwood to use Lowdown in the production, because they were planning on producing their own copycat movie, their own mockbuster, as it were, and it never quite came around. But what did happen was the Bee Gees were actually recording a brand new album in France, so Stigwood convinced them, as being their biggest act at that time, that they should provide the music for the soundtrack, and they did. But there's a lot more that happened here than just the Bee Gees. Now, I've shown you this album before. Here are some scenes from the movie. I actually have this movie on a DVD feature now that features a bunch of Travolta movies. And interestingly enough, one of them is also the follow-up, Staying Alive. I don't have the soundtrack to that, but that's a whole other story. One of these records doesn't have a sleeve. I need to get a new one for it. But this one does. And I'm going to actually give you a review of all the songs on this album. It starts out with Staying Alive, and as Henry too pointed out, this song is deeply inspired by Stevie Wonder's Superstition. And Travolta, has been quoted as talking about they were rehearsing to Stevie Wonder and Boz Scaggs. And I'm wondering if Superstition... Now, I have this thought in my mind, maybe while Travolta was, as Tony Manero, rehearsing that strutting scene down the sidewalk with the paint can, that he was originally strutting to Superstition. That's just a great thought in my head. It may never have happened, but I just love that thought. It's an interesting little idea I have. But it's a great song, and, Scott, of course, had to explain to me that lyric about the New York Times effect on men. It's kind of a deep thing about, pop culture of the time and how, different things affect people. But another song I love on here, especially when we're talking about deeply chorded, intricate songs, is the slower song, How Deep Is Your Love? A really intricately written song, but of course most of us know it. And then of course there's Night Fever, which kind of, in a way, goes directly with, Saturday Night Fever. Now, these, if I understand it, were all songs that were being recorded before the Saturday Night Fever album came out. These were not necessarily intended for this movie. And then after that, there's More Than a Woman. Now, these songs are basically the Bee Gees songs written for that album, these 4 songs right here. But they also wrote If I Can't Have You, which was performed by the Hawaiian singer Yvonne Elliman. And she did a great job in that, was also very successful. The Bee Gees also contributed 2 other cuts from their previous 2 albums. Jive Talkin', which is a fantastic, rebirth of the Bee Gees in the mid-70s. Seek out the version by Boogie Box High on YouTube, sung by George Michael. My boyfriend, the late George Michael, my boyfriend, brought that to my attention. It's fantastic. And also check out Rufus and Chaka Khan's slower, bluesier version of Jive Talkin'. That song has been covered by, I'm sure, a number of people, but it's a great material to cover. You can do a lot with it, melodically and rhythmically. And the other Bee Gees song featured on here, and really associated strongly with this movie, actually came from their previous album, Children of the World, and it's called You Should Be Dancing. It has that Latin percussion flavor to it, which, I actually read when I was younger that some people felt that Latin percussion element in disco was used as a gimmick and didn't hold ethnic identification. To me, when I listen to disco now, that Latin percussion flavor holds my ethnic identification with the music. Like, this is a Black American thing, that this actually comes from that ethic to a great degree. And that holds that identification in for me personally. Now, let's get away from the Bee Gees, because that's part of what I wanted to discuss. As outside the Bee Gees and the people who worked with them, like Blue Weaver on keyboards, this album featured a treasure trove of all the great jazz funk session people that I loved. Sonny Burke, who played with Smokey Robinson, Michael Boddicker, James Gatson, a famous session bass player, Scott Edwards, matches the name of my boyfriend. He has that joke that he played on this album. And of course, you have a couple of people participating on this album that are also from that scene. One of my favorite songs listening to this that isn't Bee Gees related is a fantastic instrumental that, to be honest with you, I kind of see it as straight up funk. You know, I mean, just listen to it, and that would be Calypso Breakdown by Ralph McDonald. And I don't know if any of you out there know who Ralph McDonald is. Ralph McDonald is essentially the East Coast equivalent of Paulinho da Costa, the major percussion session giant of that time. And, you know, Calypso Breakdown is actually the final song on his 1976 debut album as a band leader. And it's actually a strong Latin funk thing with a disco-friendly subtext. As Henrique would call it, funk functioning as disco. Now, you also get a couple of contributions on this album from a fellow named David Shire, who writes a lot of music for TV and such. One of them is a very similar song to Calypso Breakdown called Salsation. It has that strong Latin feel. Lee Retenour, one of my favorite session people turned band leader, plays on it. Sonny Burke, Scott Edwards, of course, playing bass on that. So that's a really amazing cut with some great horn and string orchestration. KG is performed by MFSB out of Philly, and it's a great, lush, Philly soul dance orchestral number. You also have another David Shire composition, which is Night on Disco Mountain. One of the things about the disco era that people sometimes love, sometimes comment on, sometimes see as a detractor for disco, is that a lot of classical music and oldies, such as Stars on 45, were adapted into medleys or disco versions for the dance floor. TV shows also went into that. Again, kind of like jazz, where disco picked up on other themes to use in it, and just added that four-on-the-floor dance beat behind it. And Night on Disco Mountain basically did that with Mussorgsky's Night on Ball Mountain. Also, again, out of that jazz flavor with Lee Retenour playing on it, and, of course, Scott Edwards and such. Now, for more of that, you also have Walter Murphy's The Fifth of Beethoven, which expanded on that. And that has a great funky clavinet part, of course. And that isn't necessarily meant to be on this album. It's from a year earlier, but it's in a similar vein. You also have Massachusetts' own Tavares doing their version of More Than a Woman, which is a little more Philly sounding, but it still has a great groove to it. And David Shire also does another number, again with the same people, including Abraham Laboriel on bass this time, and that's Manhattan Skyline, which sounds more like MFSB, you know, only a little more cinematic even than them, so you have that element into it. And there's a couple numbers in here that were also inserted just from that era, and one of them was Boogie Shoes, which is kind of a almost rocking boogie song by Casey and the Sunshine Band, led by a horn chart. And it's not the usual kind of production you would think of Casey having. So, and it doesn't really sound like anything on this album, and I really appreciate it being there. And of course the album ends with the Tramps' Disco Inferno, probably the song they're best known for, which just epitomizes that era. I don't think I need to go much more into it. Now we have Open Sesame by Kool and the Gang, one of my favorite songs by them. Again, disco functioning as funk, very jazzy. This is more or less the single version. I really prefer the version that's on the initial Very Best of Kool and the Gang from Mercury's Funk Essentials, where it covers the 60s and 70s pre-J.T. Taylor material that is kind of its own extended mix, or the album version, which is the elongated full version. But the single version is very good too. It's one of my favorite songs. I love the Genie character. I love the horns on it, are absolutely amazing. One of my favorite Kool and the Gang songs from any of their time periods. So, as you can see, Saturday Night Fever is exactly the antithesis of what I always thought, you know, disco to be. My understanding was that disco was one-dimensional, that disco reduced things down to one rhythm, and sometimes it did. But this is actually a very diverse album. and it's diverse rhythmically. And the great part about it is, all these songs of earworms can get stuck into your head. And I was watching another video by a man who's actually a huge Beatle fan, and his name is Mean Mr. Mayo. If you're a Beatle fan especially, you should go check him out. But he was talking about how he, and I've had this happen to me too, have often been forced by people to have a certain musical opinion, yet branch out and listen to everything rather than have specific taste. And that contradiction really covers this album. I was always told by a lot of people I didn't really know well, you should listen to a diverse array of music, but don't listen to this. And that's contradicting yourself in a few seconds. Because if you truly love music, you find something you like and you explore it to the best of your ability. You don't need to search for all kinds of things just because you have to do it. You should have a passion for it, and it should catch you. And that's what's important. Not everybody's going to have the same taste. And with Saturday Night Fever, I didn't realize until recently, until its anniversary came up and it's 40 years old, just how much of my own personal musical tastes are reflected in the musicians and the sound of this album. This is actually 15 times platinum. It's actually the biggest selling soundtrack to date in history, and they're going to be reissuing it. I may actually pick that up, but I like listening to Scott's version of this album. It has songs that I don't have anywhere else in my collection in a lot of ways, and they all sound really good together. And the best part is, like I said, disco could be anything. It could be, a salsa, it could be a country polka, it could be rock-oriented underneath the disco beat, or guitars or whatever, or other instruments. But the disco here primarily is based in jazz and Latin and funk styles. That's the disco that came out here. And disco had been around for a long time as a medium for DJs to play music at clubs and people to dance to it. But this is where disco entered into the popular idiom. This is where you started to see all the discos open up, and Studio 54 came around, and some even said this is the beginning of the quote-unquote, I don't like to use this term, death of disco. But this is where it was at in terms of that. This really put the disco sound into the popular consciousness, and consequently began the popular end of the disco era. Disco had been around for a long time, especially within the black and Latin communities, but it finally came into the mainstream at this point and gained a crossover audience. So Saturday Night Fever is an important album culturally, commercially. It's actually, again, one of those albums that was preserved by the National Sound Registry, and for good reason. If you want to understand the best quality of music of the disco era in terms of its popular acclaim, this is it. There's a lot of great funk, a lot of great jazzy cuts on here. It's going to make you want to sing, it's going to make you want to tap your foot, play a little air bass, a little air guitar, maybe singing your best Barry Gibb imitation, whatever, It just has that feel of getting you into it. And that's how I want to celebrate Saturday Night Fever's 40th anniversary of its soundtrack. That it just gets all parts of you moving. And what more from music could you possibly want? See you next time. Happy anniversary, Saturday Night Fever. Peace.